My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm a software architect who believes in precision. Code either works or it doesn't. Systems are either secure or they're vulnerable. My world operates on clear logic and defined parameters. That's why what happened with the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association caught me so off guard. I live with my partner Riley in a modest 2-story home on Maple Street. We chose this neighborhood for its tree-lined streets and the promise of a peaceful suburban life. Our house has a small front yard, a decent backyard, and most importantly to me, a detached 2-car garage where I've set up my home office. When we bought our electric Nissan Leaf 2 years ago, I installed a level 2 charging station on the exterior wall of our garage. It's a sleek unit that draws 32 amps at 240 volts, perfectly calculated to charge our car overnight using off-peak electricity rates. I pulled all the proper permits, hired a licensed electrician, and had everything inspected. The installation is clean, professional, and completely code compliant. The charging station sits discreetly on the side wall of our garage, barely visible from the street. A heavy-duty outdoor outlet feeds it, and I've programmed the unit to automatically start charging at 11 p.m. when electricity rates drop. It's an elegant solution that saves us money and reduces our carbon footprint. Everything was perfect until Brenda Morrison moved in next door. Brenda arrived 6 months ago with a U-Haul, a bad attitude, and immediate ambitions to join the HOA board. She's a retired real estate agent with perfectly coiffed silver hair and an opinion about everything. Within 2 weeks of moving in, she was elected to the HOA as the Architectural Standards Coordinator, a position that apparently didn't exist until she created it. Her first order of business was a neighborhood improvement initiative that involved walking around with a clipboard, photographing violations, and issuing citations for everything from mailbox heights to fence colors. My first encounter with her authority came on a Tuesday morning when I found a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Violation notice. It read in bold letters. Unauthorized exterior electrical installation visible from common areas. Homeowner must seek retroactive approval from Architectural Review Committee within 10 business days, or face daily fines of $50. I stared at the notice, genuinely confused. My charging station had been there for over a year before Brenda arrived. More importantly, I had checked the HOA covenants before installation. There was no mention of requiring approval for electrical outlets or charging stations. I knocked on Brenda's door that evening, the notice in my hand and a diplomatic smile on my face. "Hi, Brenda. I got your notice about my car charger. I think there might be some confusion." She opened the door wearing a floral housecoat and a stern expression. "No confusion, Marcus. That unsightly electrical contraption is clearly visible from the sidewalk. It's an eyesore that affects property values." "But the HOA covenants don't mention charging stations," I replied, keeping my voice level. "And I have all the proper permits." "The covenants are a living document," she said with the authority of someone who had clearly memorized that phrase. "As neighborhood standards evolve, so must our interpretation of community guidelines. Your device creates visual pollution." Visual pollution. I looked back at my charging station, a sleek white box about the size of a laptop mounted neatly beside the garage. Meanwhile, Brenda's front yard featured a collection of garden gnomes, plastic flamingos, and a gazing ball that could be seen from 3 blocks away. "I'd like to appeal this decision to the full HOA board," I said. "You're welcome to do that," she replied with a smug smile. "The next board meeting is scheduled for 3 weeks from Thursday. Until then, the violation stands." That night, I did what any logical person would do. I researched. I pulled the original HOA covenants, every amendment, and the architectural guidelines. I studied local electrical codes and permit requirements. I documented the installation date of my charger and gathered photos showing it was clearly present before Brenda's arrival. The evidence was clear. There was no violation. But as I would soon learn, facts and Brenda Morrison's interpretation of her authority were two very different things. The problem started small. 2 days after our conversation, I woke up to find the charging cable for my car had been unplugged and coiled on the ground. The car hadn't charged overnight, leaving me with barely enough power to get to work. I assumed it was an accident. Maybe someone had bumped into it while walking their dog. I plugged it back in and thought nothing more of it. The next morning, same thing. Cable unplugged, car uncharged. This time I checked my home security app. I have a basic camera system covering the driveway, mainly for package deliveries. The footage showed a figure in dark clothing approaching my car at 3:47 a.m. and deliberately unplugging the cable. The image was grainy, but the person was clearly familiar with the area, moving confidently through my driveway. They knew exactly where the charging port was located and how to disconnect it. I installed a motion sensor light above the charging station the next day. If someone was going to sabotage my car, they'd have to do it in full illumination. The light worked. The unplugging stopped. But Brenda's campaign didn't. The following week, I received another notice. This time it was for unauthorized modification of exterior lighting due to my new motion sensor. Apparently, the light fixture wasn't architecturally consistent with neighborhood standards. 2 days later, another notice arrived. Violation of quiet hours ordinance. Someone had complained that my car made a high-pitched whining noise during charging that disturbed the peace. Never mind that the charging process is virtually silent and happens inside a closed garage. I started keeping detailed records. Every notice, every interaction, every attempt at sabotage. I documented dates, times, and took photographs. My software developer instincts kicked in, treating this like debugging a complex system with multiple failure points. The real escalation began when Brenda discovered that I was working from home 3 days a week. Suddenly, my home office became a commercial business operation that violated residential zoning restrictions. Never mind that half the neighborhood worked remotely, and many ran small businesses from home. The notices kept coming. My garbage cans were improperly positioned on collection day. My lawn was inconsistently maintained despite being professionally serviced weekly. My mailbox was non-compliant with postal regulations, even though it had been approved by the Postal Service. Each violation came with the threat of escalating fines and potential legal action. Brenda had weaponized the HOA against me, using bureaucracy as a cudgel to force compliance with her personal vendetta. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in early October. I was in my garage working on my laptop when I heard voices outside. Through the window, I saw Brenda standing next to my charging station with 2 men I didn't recognize. One was wearing a contractor's vest and holding a clipboard. The other had an official-looking badge hanging from his neck. I walked outside to investigate. "Excuse me, what's going on here?" Brenda turned to me with the satisfied expression of someone who believed they held all the cards. "Marcus, this is Mike from Peterson Electric and Inspector Williams from the County Code Enforcement Office. We're here to evaluate your unauthorized electrical installation." I felt my jaw tighten. Unauthorized? I have all the permits for this installation. Inspector Williams, a tired-looking man in his 50s, stepped forward. "Sir, we received a complaint about potential code violations. Mind if I take a look at your permit documentation?" I retrieved the permits from my office and handed them over. Williams examined them carefully, then compared them to the actual installation. After 10 minutes, he looked up. "Everything appears to be in order here. The installation matches the permitted plans and meets current electrical codes." Brenda's face flushed red. "But it's clearly an eyesore that affects property values. The HOA has authority over architectural standards." "Ma'am," Williams replied patiently, "HOA architectural authority doesn't override local electrical codes or properly issued permits. This installation is legal and compliant." The contractor, Mike, nodded in agreement. "It's a clean install. Better than most I see, actually." I should have felt vindicated, but I could see the fury building in Brenda's eyes. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. That night, my security camera captured Brenda pacing back and forth in front of my house at 11:30 p.m., talking animatedly on her phone. The next morning, I received an overnight delivery envelope containing a formal legal notice. "Cease and desist," the letterhead read. It was from a law firm I'd never heard of, demanding that I immediately discontinue all unauthorized electrical activities and remove non-compliant installations within 72 hours or face legal action for violating community standards. I called my insurance company and was referred to a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. Jennifer Rodriguez was a sharp attorney who had seen this type of harassment before. "This is what we call HOA bullying," she explained during our consultation. One board member decides they don't like something and uses their position to wage a personal campaign. "The good news is that you've documented everything. The bad news is that this will probably get worse before it gets better." She was right. The next escalation came in the form of a special HOA meeting called specifically to address my violations. Brenda had somehow convinced the other board members that my charging station represented a community safety hazard that required immediate action. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community center. I arrived with Riley, Jennifer Rodriguez, and a folder full of documentation. About 30 neighbors were in attendance, far more than usual for an HOA meeting. Brenda stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor presenting her case. She had prepared a PowerPoint presentation titled, "Protecting Our Community Standards." Slide after slide showed photos of my charging station from various angles, dramatically zoomed in to make it appear larger and more intrusive than it actually was. "This unauthorized industrial equipment," she declared, pointing at a photo, "represents a clear violation of our residential character. Electric vehicle charging stations are commercial installations that have no place in a family neighborhood." The irony was rich. 3 other houses on our street had visible EV chargers, but somehow mine was the only one that constituted a threat to residential character. When it was my turn to speak, I methodically presented my evidence. The permits, the code compliance documentation, the timeline showing my installation predated Brenda's arrival, and the inspector's written verification that everything was legal and safe. "This isn't about community standards," I told the room. "This is about one person's personal grievances being imposed on the entire community." The Q&A session that followed was revealing. Several neighbors expressed support for electric vehicles and wondered why charging stations would be problematic. Others questioned whether the HOA had the authority to override county permits. But the most damaging moment for Brenda came when my neighbor, Tom Fletcher, stood up to speak. "I live 2 doors down from Marcus," Tom said. "I've watched this whole situation unfold and I have to say something. Last month, Brenda approached me and asked if I'd be willing to file a noise complaint about Marcus's charger. When I told her I'd never heard any noise, she suggested I should file one anyway because it would help build the case. That doesn't sound like community protection to me. That sounds like harassment." Murmurs rippled through the room. Other neighbors began sharing their own experiences with Brenda's overzealous enforcement actions. The meeting that was supposed to be my trial had become Brenda's reckoning. The vote wasn't even close. The board rejected Brenda's motion to force removal of my charging station by a margin of 4-1, with only Brenda voting in favor. But I knew this wouldn't end there. Sure enough, the retaliation began the following week. Every morning brought a new petty violation notice. My newspaper was improperly placed on the driveway. My car was parked in a non-compliant manner, despite being entirely within my designated space. My front porch light was excessively bright and disturbing neighbors. The daily fines started accumulating. $50 here, $75 there. Each notice demanded immediate payment and threatened legal action for non-compliance. I was spending more time documenting Brenda's harassment than doing my actual job. The stress was affecting Riley, who started talking about selling the house and moving somewhere. Without an HOA, that's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. I hired a private investigator to look into Brenda Morrison's background. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. She had a history of HOA conflicts at her previous residences. In her last neighborhood, she had been removed from the board after orchestrating a similar harassment campaign against a neighbor who had opposed her on a landscaping issue. More importantly, the investigator discovered that Brenda had been submitting false documentation to support her violation notices. She had been taking photos with wide-angle lenses and extreme close-ups to exaggerate the visual impact of infractions. She had also been backdating complaints to make it appear that violations existed before they were actually reported. Armed with this information, Jennifer Rodriguez and I filed a formal complaint with the state's Department of Commerce, which oversees HOA operations. We also sent a comprehensive legal demand to the HOA board, documenting the pattern of harassment and demanding Brenda's immediate removal. The demand letter was a masterpiece of legal precision. It outlined every false violation, every retaliatory action, and every instance of procedural abuse. It included sworn statements from neighbors who had witnessed Brenda's misconduct and photographic evidence of her documentation manipulation. Most importantly, it made clear that continued harassment would result in a federal civil rights lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act. Since Brenda's actions could be construed as discrimination against electric vehicle owners, the response was swift. Within 48 hours, I received a call from Robert Kim, The HOA board president requesting an emergency meeting. Marcus, I want you to know that the board had no idea about the extent of what's been happening, Robert said when we met at his house that evening. We trusted Brenda to handle architectural compliance professionally. When we saw your legal documentation, we realized we had a serious problem. He handed me a formal letter. It was Brenda's resignation from the HOA board, effective immediately. The letter included an acknowledgement that her enforcement actions had exceeded her authority and an agreement to reimburse all fines that had been improperly assessed. We're also implementing new procedures to prevent this kind of abuse in the future, Robert continued. All violation notices will require approval from the full board, and we're establishing a formal appeals process for disputed citations. The piece lasted exactly 3 weeks. Although Brenda was no longer on the HOA board, she still lived next door, and she still had access to my property line. The new harassment was more subtle but equally malicious. She began filing noise complaints with the county about my excessive use of power tools. Even when I was simply charging my laptop in the garage, she reported my car as abandoned when I worked from home for several consecutive days. She called animal control to report my aggressive behavior toward her cat, an animal I had never even seen. Each false report required time and energy to address. I had to take time off work to meet with investigators, provide documentation, and defend myself against baseless accusations. The breaking point came when Brenda began interfering with my electrical service. On a Tuesday morning in November, I discovered that someone had turned off the main breaker to my garage, cutting power to my home office and charging station. The electrical panel was located on the side of my house, technically accessible from the property line. There were no signs of forced entry, but the breaker had clearly been deliberately switched off. I reset it and installed a security camera focused specifically on the electrical panel. 2 nights later, the camera captured Brenda Morrison sneaking onto my property at 2:30 a.m. and switching off my power. This was no longer harassment. This was criminal trespassing and sabotage. I called the police and filed a formal complaint. The video evidence was clear and undeniable. Within an hour, officers were at Brenda's door with a citation for criminal trespassing and destruction of property. Her arrest made the local news. HOA dispute leads to criminal charges was the headline in the weekly community paper. The story detailed the months-long harassment campaign and included quotes from several neighbors who had experienced similar treatment. The publicity was the final nail in Brenda's coffin. Within a week, she had put her house on the market and moved in with relatives in another state. Her realtor later told me that she couldn't handle the stress of being surrounded by hostile neighbors. The irony was perfect. The woman who had tried to drive me from the neighborhood had driven herself away instead. Today, my charging station continues to work flawlessly. I've upgraded it to a newer model with smart scheduling and load balancing features. 3 more neighbors have installed EV chargers, and the HOA has actually updated its architectural guidelines to streamline the approval process for electric vehicle infrastructure. Brenda's replacement on the board is David Park, a retired engineer who understands that modern neighborhoods need modern solutions. Under his leadership, the HOA has focused on genuine community improvements rather than petty enforcement actions. I learned several valuable lessons from this experience. First, documentation is everything. My meticulous record-keeping was what ultimately protected me from false accusations and legal threats. Second, HOA boards derive their power from community consent, and that consent can be withdrawn when board members abuse their authority. Most importantly, I learned that standing up to bullies is essential, even when it's expensive and time-consuming. Brenda Morrison's harassment wasn't really about my charging station. It was about power and control. She needed to demonstrate that she could force compliance through intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. By refusing to be intimidated and methodically documenting her misconduct, I was able to expose her abuse and protect not just myself, but future residents who might have faced similar treatment. The charging station still hums quietly in my garage every night, converting electrical energy into the power that moves our car, but it has become something more than a convenience appliance. It's a symbol of the principle that property rights and personal freedom don't disappear just because you live in a community with shared rules. Sometimes standing your ground is about more than the ground itself. Sometimes it's about the right to live peacefully in your own home, without fear of arbitrary punishment or retaliatory harassment. Riley and I still live on Maple Street. We still love our neighborhood, our house, and our electric car. And every morning when I walk past that charging station, I'm reminded that some battles are worth fighting, especially when they're fought with truth, patience, and a really good lawyer. But this was only the beginning of a much larger transformation in our community. Chapter 2. Ripple Effects. The week after Brenda's departure, I thought life would return to normal. I was wrong. Her arrest and the media coverage had created a ripple effect throughout Meadowbrook Hills that none of us anticipated. The first sign came from an unexpected source, my employer. TechFlow Dynamics, the software consulting firm where I worked as a senior architect, had seen the news coverage. My manager, Sandra Williams, called me into her office on a Monday morning with a concerned expression. "Marcus, I need to ask you about this HOA situation that's been in the news," she said, closing the door behind us. "Some of our clients are asking questions." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" "Well, Meridian Industries saw the article about your arrest." "My arrest?" I interrupted. "Sandra, I wasn't arrested. The HOA board member was arrested for trespassing on my property." Sandra pulled up the news article on her computer and turned the screen toward me. The headline read, "Local software engineer involved in HOA criminal case." The article was technically accurate, but the headline and opening paragraph made it sound like I was the one facing charges. "I can see how this could be misinterpreted," Sandra said carefully. "But Meridian is concerned about having team members who might be involved in neighborhood disputes that escalate to criminal charges. It raises questions about judgment and stability." This was exactly what I had feared. Brenda's campaign of harassment wasn't just affecting my home life. It was threatening my career. "Sandra, I can provide you with all the documentation showing that I was the victim here, not the perpetrator. I have police reports, security footage, and court records." "I know you can, and I believe you," she replied. "But I need you to understand that client perception matters. We might need to consider reassigning you from the Meridian project until this gets resolved." I spent the rest of that day compiling a comprehensive file of evidence to clear my name with my employer. The irony was bitter. I was having to defend myself at work for the crime of being victimized by a vindictive neighbor. Meanwhile, Riley was dealing with their own fallout. As a teacher at Meadowbrook Elementary, they were facing questions from parents and administrators about the incident involving our family. The school district was particularly sensitive about any publicity that might reflect poorly on their employees. 3 parents have already asked to have their children moved out of my class, Riley told me over dinner that Tuesday. They're worried that I might be unstable because of our legal troubles. The stress was taking its toll on both of us. Riley had always been the calm one in our relationship, the steady presence who kept me grounded when my engineer's mind got too focused on solving problems, but now I could see the strain in their face. The way they rubbed their temples when they thought I wasn't looking. "Maybe we should consider moving," Riley said quietly. "Start fresh somewhere else." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. We had worked so hard to make this house our home. We had invested thousands of dollars in improvements, built relationships with neighbors, and created a life here. The idea of letting Brenda Morrison's vindictiveness drive us away felt like admitting defeat. "No," I said firmly. "We're not running away. This is our home, and we have every right to be here." But privately, I was beginning to wonder if I was being stubborn or principled. Was I fighting for justice, or was I just too proud to admit that sometimes the bullies win? The answer came from an unexpected source. My neighbor across the street, Elena Vasquez. Elena was a retired civil rights attorney who had moved to Meadowbrook Hills 5 years earlier. She was a quiet woman who kept to herself, tending her garden and reading on her front porch. I had exchanged pleasantries with her over the years, but didn't know her well. She knocked on my door on Wednesday evening, carrying a plate of homemade tamales and a thick folder of documents. "Marcus, I hope you don't mind me coming by unannounced," she said. "I've been following your situation with Mrs. Morrison, and I think there are some things you should know." Elena's folder contained a treasure trove of information that changed everything I thought I knew about Brenda Morrison and the politics of our neighborhood. "I've lived through this before," Elena explained as we sat in my living room. Not here, but in my previous neighborhood in Phoenix. Same pattern, same tactics, same type of person. She showed me copies of news articles from Phoenix dating back 8 years. Retired real estate agent faces harassment charges in HOA dispute. The photo accompanying the article showed a younger but unmistakably familiar face. Brenda Morrison. She was forced to resign from that HOA board too, Elena continued. But the pattern goes back further. I did some research after she moved here. Jacksonville, Tampa, Denver. She's left a trail of neighborhood conflicts wherever she's gone. The documents told a disturbing story. In Jacksonville, Brenda had targeted a family with young children, filing noise complaints and code violations until they were forced to sell their home. In Tampa, she had orchestrated a campaign against an elderly widower who couldn't keep up with her interpretation of landscaping standards. In Denver, she had focused her attention on a young professional couple who had installed solar panels on their roof. The pattern is always the same, Elena explained. She targets someone who represents change or challenges her vision of how the neighborhood should be. She uses her position on the HOA board to make their lives miserable until they give up and leave. I stared at the documents, feeling a mix of vindication and horror. Why didn't anyone stop her before? Because it works, Elena said sadly. Most people don't have the resources or energy to fight back. It's easier to move than to wage a legal battle against someone who has weaponized bureaucracy. Elena's next revelation was even more shocking. She showed me a series of property records and real estate transactions from Brenda's previous neighborhoods. In every case, after her target family moved away, Brenda or her associates purchased their property at below-market prices. In Phoenix, she bought the house directly. In Tampa, her brother-in-law was the buyer. In Denver, it was a business partner from her real estate days. The implications were staggering. Brenda Morrison wasn't just a petty tyrant with control issues. She was running a systematic scheme to drive down property values and profit from the distress sales of her victims. She targeted you because you have one of the nicest houses on the street, Elena continued, and because your electric vehicle charging station gave her a pretext to claim the neighborhood was being commercialized. She was probably planning to cite declining property values when she made an offer on your house. I felt a cold rage building in my chest. This wasn't just harassment, it was fraud. Brenda had been systematically destroying families and communities for personal profit. Elena, why are you telling me this? She smiled sadly. Because I should have spoken up sooner. I recognized the pattern when she started targeting you, but I hoped it would resolve itself. I was a coward, and I'm sorry for that. Elena's information changed everything. This was no longer just about defending my property rights or winning a personal dispute. Brenda Morrison was a serial predator who had been allowed to operate unchecked for years. Someone needed to stop her. I called Jennifer Rodriguez the next morning and shared Elena's findings. Her response was immediate and decisive. Marcus, this changes our entire strategy. We're not just dealing with HOA harassment anymore. This is potentially criminal fraud on a multi-state level. I need to bring in a partner who specializes in federal cases. Within 48 hours, Jennifer had connected me with David Chang, a federal prosecutor who had recently left the U.S. Attorney's Office to start his own practice. David specialized in complex fraud cases involving real estate and consumer protection. The Morrison case has all the elements of a federal racketeering charge, David explained during our meeting. She's engaged in a pattern of criminal activity across state lines for financial gain. The challenge is proving the coordination and intent. David's plan was ambitious. We would file a federal lawsuit against Brenda Morrison under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, the same law typically used to prosecute organized crime families. We would also coordinate with law enforcement agencies in multiple states to build a comprehensive criminal case. But David warned me that this level of legal action would require a massive commitment of time, money, and emotional energy. This isn't just about getting your HOA fees back, Marcus. We're talking about a multi-year federal case that could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and require you to testify in multiple jurisdictions. Are you prepared for that? I looked at Riley, who had been silent during most of the meeting. They reached over and took my hand. We're in, Riley said quietly. Someone needs to stop her from doing this to other families. That decision transformed my life in ways I never anticipated. Chapter 3. Going Federal. Federal investigation into Brenda Morrison's activities began 6 weeks after her arrest for trespassing on my property. FBI Special Agent Sarah Mitchell was assigned as the lead investigator, and she turned out to be exactly the kind of meticulous, detail-oriented person you'd want building a complex fraud case. Agent Mitchell was a former accountant who had joined the Bureau specifically to work white-collar crime cases. She understood both the financial and legal intricacies of real estate fraud, and she had the patience to build cases that could withstand federal court scrutiny. Our first meeting was in a conference room at the local FBI field office. Agent Mitchell, David Chang, Jennifer Rodriguez, and I sat around a polished table while Elena Vasquez joined us by video conference from her home. "Mr. Chen, I want to be clear about what we're dealing with here," Agent Mitchell began. "Based on the preliminary evidence you've provided, we believe Ms. Morrison may have defrauded property owners in at least 4 states over the past decade. The total financial impact could exceed $2 million. She opened a thick folder and spread out a series of charts and timelines. We've identified at least 12 families who were targeted by Ms. Morrison's harassment campaigns. In every case, the family eventually sold their property at a significant loss. In 7 cases, Ms. Morrison or her associates were the eventual buyers. The scope of the scheme was breathtaking. Brenda hadn't just been a difficult neighbor, she had been operating a sophisticated real estate fraud operation that had destroyed dozens of families' financial security. The IEA challenge is proving coordination and intent," Agent Mitchell continued. "Ms. Morrison has been careful to use different business entities and family members as purchasers. She's also been strategic about timing, waiting months or even years between her harassment campaigns and the property purchases." Elena leaned forward on the video screen. "Agent Mitchell, I have some additional information that might be helpful. I've been in contact with some of the other victims, and they've shared some interesting details." Elena had been busy since our first meeting. Using her legal contacts and investigative skills, she had tracked down 8 of the families who had been targeted by Brenda's schemes. What she discovered was a level of psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple harassment. In every case, the families reported the same pattern, Elena explained. First, Ms. Morrison would identify some aspect of their property or lifestyle that could be characterized as non-compliant with community standards. Then she would begin a campaign of escalating violations and fines. But here's the key detail. About 6 months into the harassment campaign, she would approach the family privately and offer to help them resolve their HOA problems. She would suggest that they might be happier in a different neighborhood and offer to connect them with a real estate agent who could help them sell quickly. Agent Mitchell was taking detailed notes. "Let me guess. The real estate agent was either Ms. Morrison herself or someone working with her." "Exactly. And the agent would typically suggest a listing price that was 10 to 15% below market value, claiming that the HOA issues had damaged the property's marketability. The picture that emerged was of a predator who had refined her techniques over years of practice. Brenda Morrison had turned neighborhood harassment into a profitable business model, but the investigation revealed an even more disturbing element. She hadn't been working alone. Agent Mitchell's team had traced financial records showing regular communications and money transfers between Brenda and a network of associates across multiple states. There was her brother-in-law in Tampa, a former business partner in Denver, and a property management company in Phoenix that had purchased several of the distressed properties. "We're looking at what appears to be an organized network of real estate fraudsters," Agent Mitchell explained. Ms. Morrison was the front person who would infiltrate HOA boards and identify targets. Her associates would handle the property purchases and resales. The investigation also revealed that Brenda had been remarkably sophisticated in her target selection. She would research property values, mortgage records, and family circumstances before choosing her victims. She preferred families with children, who couldn't easily move, high-stress professions, who had less time to fight back, and properties with significant equity that could generate substantial profits when sold, below market value. My case had been different because I had the technical skills to document her harassment and the financial resources to fight back. Most of her previous victims hadn't been as fortunate. As the federal investigation progressed, I found myself becoming an unofficial coordinator for the other victims. Elena had connected me with families in 4 different states, and we began sharing information and supporting each other through the legal process. There was the Rodriguez family in Phoenix, who had lost their dream home after Brenda's harassment campaign convinced them their children weren't safe in the neighborhood. There was retired teacher Margaret Walsh in Tampa, who had been forced to sell the house where she had planned to spend her golden years. There was the young couple in Denver, Sarah and Mike Thompson, who had used their entire life savings for a down payment only to be driven away by escalating HOA fines and legal threats. Each family's story was heartbreaking, but together they formed a powerful case for prosecution. More importantly, they demonstrated that Brenda Morrison's crimes had real human costs that went far beyond financial losses. The psychological impact on the victims was severe. Several families reported ongoing anxiety and depression related to their experiences. Children had been traumatized by the stress of constant conflict and uncertainty. Marriages had been strained to the breaking point. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher from Tampa, put it most eloquently during one of our video conference calls. She didn't just steal our house, she stole our sense of security, our trust in our community, and our faith that doing the right thing would be enough to protect us. As the federal investigation expanded, my own life became increasingly complicated. I was spending 20 to 30 hours per week on case-related activities, reviewing documents, participating in interviews, coordinating with other victims, and traveling for depositions. Riley was incredibly supportive, but the strain was beginning to show. We had planned to start a family, but the uncertainty and stress of the federal case made us postpone those plans. Our social life had virtually disappeared as weekends became consumed with legal meetings and case preparation. The media attention was also intensifying. The story of a multi-state real estate fraud scheme orchestrated through HOA harassment was too compelling for journalists to ignore. I found myself fielding calls from reporters, appearing on local news programs, and even being interviewed for a documentary about HOA abuse. While the publicity helped raise awareness about the broader issues, it also made our lives increasingly public. I had neighbors I barely knew approaching me in the grocery store to share their own HOA horror stories. Real estate agents were calling to offer their services. Legal advocacy groups were requesting my participation in their campaigns. For HOA reform, the most surreal moment came when I received a call from a producer at a major television network who wanted to option the rights to our story for a made-for-TV movie. "We're thinking, Matthew. McConaughey for your character," the producer said with complete sincerity. "He has that quiet intensity that would work perfectly for an engineer fighting corporate corruption." I declined the movie option, but the call reminded me of how much my life had changed since that first violation notice appeared on my door. Chapter 4. The network unravels. The break in the federal case came from an unexpected source: Brenda Morrison's own arrogance. 6 months into the FBI investigation, Brenda made a critical mistake. Despite being under federal scrutiny and facing criminal charges in our jurisdiction, she attempted to replicate her scheme in a new location. Agent Mitchell called me on a Tuesday morning with barely contained excitement in her voice. "Marcus, you're not going to believe this. Morrison just joined the HOA board in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, and she's already started targeting a family with a disability-accessible van that she claims is commercial equipment." The family in question was the Patels, a couple in their 60s whose adult son had been paralyzed in a car accident. They had purchased a specially equipped van and installed a wheelchair ramp at their home to accommodate his needs. Brenda had immediately filed complaints, claiming that the ramp was an unauthorized structural modification and the van was a commercial vehicle that violated residential parking restrictions. What Brenda didn't know was that the Patel's son, David, was a software engineer who worked for a cybersecurity firm. When David became suspicious of the sudden harassment campaign, he did what any good cybersecurity professional would do. He started investigating. David's digital forensic skills were impressive. He had traced Brenda's online activities, identified her social media connections, and discovered financial records that she had thought were private. His investigation had uncovered the same network of associates that the FBI was tracking, but with additional details that proved invaluable to the federal case. "David Patel has agreed to work with us as a cooperating witness," Agent Mitchell explained. "He's going to document everything Morrison does and help us gather real-time evidence of her operation." The opportunity to catch Brenda in the act was too good to pass up. Agent Mitchell's team set up a sophisticated surveillance operation in Scottsdale, monitoring Brenda's communications and documenting her harassment techniques as they unfolded. The surveillance revealed the full extent of Brenda's network and methodology. She was in regular contact with a property investor named Charles Brennan, who had been her partner in multiple schemes. Brennan would research target properties and provide Brenda with detailed profiles of potential victims. Brenda would then join local HOA boards and begin her harassment campaigns. The FBI recorded phone conversations between Brenda and Brennan discussing strategy for the Patel case. The disability angle is perfect, Brenda could be heard saying on one recording. We can claim they're running an unlicensed medical facility out of their home. The neighbors will eat that up. Brennan's response was equally chilling. How long do you think it will take to get them to sell? I've got cash ready to make an offer as soon as they list. These recordings provided the smoking gun that prosecutors needed to prove criminal intent and coordination. Brenda Morrison wasn't just a difficult neighbor, she was a calculating predator who viewed families in distress as profit opportunities. The Scottsdale surveillance also revealed how Brenda recruited accomplices within HOA communities. She would identify residents who were susceptible to fear-based messaging about property values and community standards. She would then cultivate these individuals as allies who would support her harassment campaigns and provide cover for her activities. Her techniques were sophisticated and manipulative. She would start by identifying legitimate but minor violations: a slightly overgrown lawn, a holiday decoration left up too long, a car parked at a slightly wrong angle. She would then escalate these minor issues into major community standards problems that required immediate action. Brenda was particularly skilled at exploiting existing tensions within communities. If there were racial or economic divisions, she would find ways to make her targets seem like threats to the community's character. If there were generational conflicts, she would position herself as defending traditional values against unwelcome changes. The psychological manipulation was as sophisticated as the financial fraud. Brenda understood that most people want to fit in and avoid conflict. By making her target seem like problems that the community needed to solve, she could isolate them and make them feel like their only option was to leave. But her most powerful weapon was the HOA system itself. She understood that most residents didn't understand the complex rules and procedures that governed their communities. By positioning herself as an expert who was simply enforcing legitimate standards, she could make even the most outrageous harassment seem reasonable and necessary. The Scottsdale operation also revealed the full scope of the financial network supporting Brenda's schemes. Charles Brennan wasn't her only partner. There was a web of investors, property managers, and real estate professionals who were profiting from the distressed sales that Brenda generated. The FBI traced money flows through multiple shell companies and investment vehicles. They identified at least 15 people who had knowingly participated in the scheme, and dozens more who may have been unknowing accomplices. The total financial impact was staggering. Agent Mitchell's team estimated that the network had generated over $4 million in profits from artificially depressed property sales over the past decade. But the human cost was even more significant. The FBI had identified over 30 families who had been targeted by the scheme. Many had lost their homes, their savings, and their faith in the American dream of home ownership. As the federal case built momentum, I found myself at the center of a growing movement for HOA reform. Lawyers from across the country were contacting me about similar cases in their jurisdictions. Advocacy groups were asking me to testify before state legislatures about the need for stronger oversight of homeowner associations. The media attention continued to grow. Major news networks were covering the story as an example of how HOA abuse could devastate communities. I appeared on national television multiple times, always emphasizing that our case was just one example of a much larger problem. The response from the HOA industry was predictably defensive. Industry representatives claimed that our case was an isolated incident involving a rogue actor who didn't represent the vast majority of responsible HOA boards. They argued that additional regulations would burden well-intentioned communities and make housing less affordable. But other victims were coming forward. Every news story about our case generated calls and emails from families who had experienced similar harassment. Some had clear evidence of fraud, while others had simply been worn down by years of petty harassment and excessive fines. I started keeping a database of these reports, working with Elena and other advocates to identify patterns and potential legal remedies. What we found was disturbing but not surprising. HOA abuse was far more common than most people realized, and it disproportionately affected vulnerable populations, including minorities, elderly residents, and families with disabilities. The database eventually grew to include over 200 documented cases of HOA harassment across 35 states. While not all of these cases involved the sophisticated fraud scheme that Brenda Morrison had orchestrated, they demonstrated a pattern of abuse that demanded systemic reform. Chapter 5. Justice and Reform. Federal trial of Brenda Morrison and her co-conspirators began 18 months after that first violation notice appeared on my door. The case had grown far beyond my original dispute into a landmark prosecution that would set important precedents for how HOA abuse and real estate fraud would be handled in the future. The prosecution team was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, a veteran prosecutor who specialized in complex financial crimes. She had assembled a comprehensive case that included dozens of victims, hundreds of documents, and surveillance evidence that clearly demonstrated the scope and intent of Brenda's operation. The trial was held in federal court in Phoenix, chosen because it was the jurisdiction where some of the most serious fraud had occurred. I took a leave of absence from my job to participate fully in the proceedings, and Riley arranged for a substitute teacher to cover their classes. The first week of trial was devoted to establishing the scope of Brenda's scheme. Prosecutor Santos methodically presented evidence showing how Brenda had moved from state to state, infiltrating HOA boards and targeting vulnerable families for harassment campaigns. Elena Vasquez was one of the first witnesses. Her legal background and meticulous research made her an effective presenter of the documentary evidence. She walked the jury through the timeline of Brenda's activities, showing how the pattern had repeated across multiple states and communities. Mrs. Morrison wasn't just a difficult neighbor, Elena testified. She was operating a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used community institutions as weapons against innocent families. The prosecution then brought in victim after victim to testify about their experiences. The Rodriguez family from Phoenix described how Brenda's harassment had forced them to sell their dream home at a significant loss. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher from Tampa, testified about the psychological trauma that had required years of therapy to overcome. Each victim's story was heartbreaking, but together they painted a clear picture of predatory behavior that had devastating consequences for real families. My own testimony came during the second week. I spent 3 days on the witness stand, walking the jury through the timeline of harassment that had begun with that first violation notice and escalated to criminal, trespassing, and evidence tampering. The defense strategy was predictable but ineffective. Brenda's lawyer tried to portray her as an overzealous community volunteer whose good intentions had been misunderstood. He argued that she had genuinely believed she was protecting property values and community standards, but the surveillance recordings from Scottsdale destroyed any claim of good intentions. When the jury heard Brenda and Charles Brennan discussing how to exploit the Patels' disabled son to drive down their property value, the criminal nature of their enterprise became undeniable. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when David Patel, the cybersecurity expert from Scottsdale, testified about his investigation of Brenda's network. Using his technical skills, he had uncovered financial records and communications that the FBI had missed. David had discovered that Brenda had been planning to expand her operations significantly. She had been researching HOA communities across the Southwest, looking for areas with high property values and weak oversight. Her goal was to systematically target at least 50 families over the next 5 years. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges. Brenda Morrison was convicted of racketeering, mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. Charles Brennan and 3 other co-conspirators were also convicted on multiple felony charges. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later was equally dramatic. Judge Patricia Nguyen had clearly been affected by the victim impact statements and the scope of the criminal enterprise. Ms. Morrison, Judge Nguyen said before announcing the sentence, "You have violated one of the most fundamental principles of American society, the right of families to live peacefully in their own homes. You have weaponized community institutions against innocent people for your own financial gain. Brenda Morrison was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $3 million in restitution to her victims. Charles Brennan received 8 years, and the other co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years. But the legal victory was only the beginning of a much larger transformation. The national media coverage of the trial had sparked a broader conversation about HOA reform and accountability. State legislatures across the country began introducing bills to strengthen oversight of homeowner associations and protect residents from harassment. I found myself testifying before legislative committees in 8 different states, sharing our story and advocating for specific reforms. The most important changes included mandatory training for HOA board members on legal and ethical responsibilities, independent appeals processes for homeowners facing violations, and fines, criminal penalties for HOA board members who abuse their authority, financial disclosure requirements to prevent conflicts of interest, stronger state oversight of HOA operations and finances. Riley and I also established the Meadowbrook Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting families who face HOA harassment and advocating for systemic reform. The foundation provided legal assistance to victims, educated homeowners about their rights, and worked with policymakers to strengthen consumer protections. The foundation's first major success was the passage of the Homeowner Protection Act in our state, legislation that established an independent ombudsman's office to investigate HOA disputes and provided legal remedies for victims of harassment. But the most meaningful change was happening at the local level. Our experience had transformed the culture of Meadowbrook Hills and surrounding communities. Residents were more engaged in HOA governance, more aware of their rights, and more willing to speak up when they saw abuse. David Park, our new HOA board president, had implemented reforms that made our community a model for responsible governance. All board meetings were now recorded and live-streamed. Violation notices required approval from the full board. Appeals processes were clearly defined and fairly administered. Most importantly, the board had adopted a philosophy that HOA rules should serve the community, not the other way around. The goal was to help neighbors resolve disputes and maintain property values, not to generate revenue through fines and violations. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some longtime residents resented the increased oversight and transparency. They preferred the old system where a small group of volunteers could make decisions without much public scrutiny. But the new approach was clearly working. Property values in Meadowbrook Hills had actually increased since the reforms were implemented. Neighbors were more cooperative and engaged. The community felt more like an actual community rather than a collection of individual properties governed by arbitrary rules. Epilogue. Lessons learned. 5. Years have passed since that first violation notice appeared on my door. The charging station still sits on the side of our garage, working perfectly and charging our car every night. But it has become something more than a convenience appliance. It's a symbol of the principle that American families should be able to live peacefully in their own homes. Riley and I have built the life we always wanted in Meadowbrook Hills. We have 2 young children now, and watching them play in our backyard reminds me every day of what we were fighting for. This isn't just our house, it's our home, and it's the place where our children will form their first memories of what community means. The Meadowbrook Foundation has grown beyond anything I imagined when we started it. We now have offices in 12 states and have helped over 500 families deal with HOA harassment. More importantly, we've been instrumental in passing HOA reform legislation in over 20 states. The work isn't finished. HOA abuse continues to be a serious problem in communities across the country. But there's now a growing awareness of the issue, and a network of advocates working to protect homeowners' rights. I still work as a software architect, though I now split my time between consulting projects and foundation work. The technical skills that helped me document Brenda Morrison's harassment have proven valuable in helping other victims gather evidence and build cases against abusive HOA boards. Elena Vasquez has become one of my closest friends and most trusted advisors. Her legal expertise and investigative skills have been instrumental in many of our foundation's successes. She often jokes that she should have become a detective instead of a civil rights lawyer. The other victims from Brenda's scheme have all moved on with their lives, though the experience changed all of us permanently. Margaret Walsh, the retired teacher from Tampa, became a volunteer with our foundation and has helped dozens of elderly homeowners deal with HOA harassment. The Rodriguez family bought a new home in Phoenix and are active in local politics, working to ensure that other families don't face what they went through. David Patel, the cybersecurity expert from Scottsdale, developed software that helps homeowners document HOA violations and track their interactions with board members. His tools have been invaluable in building cases against abusive boards and helping victims prove their claims. Rena Morrison is currently serving her sentence in a federal prison in Texas. She will be eligible for parole in 8 years, though the financial restitution requirements mean that she will be paying for her crimes for the rest of her life. Charles Brennan and the other co-conspirators have all been released, though they face ongoing civil lawsuits from victims and are prohibited from serving on HOA boards or working in real estate. The financial network that supported their scheme has been dismantled, and the profits have been recovered and distributed to victims. The legal precedents established by our case have been used in dozens of subsequent prosecutions. Federal prosecutors now have clear authority to pursue criminal charges against HOA officials who abuse their authority for personal gain. Civil rights attorneys have new tools to protect homeowners from harassment and discrimination. But the most important lesson I learned from this experience isn't about law or policy. It's about the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult and expensive and time-consuming. I could have avoided this entire ordeal by simply removing my charging station when Brenda first demanded it. It would have been easier to comply than to fight. But giving in to unreasonable demands doesn't make them go away. It just encourages more unreasonable demands. Sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never planned to fight. When I installed that charging station, I was just trying to make my life a little more convenient and environmentally responsible. I never imagined it would become the center of a federal criminal case that would change my life and help protect hundreds of other families. The experience taught me that individual actions can have far-reaching consequences. My decision to document everything, to seek legal help, and to refuse to be intimidated didn't just protect my family, it exposed a criminal enterprise and led to systemic reforms that will protect thousands of future families. It also taught me about the importance of community in the truest sense of the word. Not the artificial community created by HOA covenants and architectural guidelines, but the real community that emerges when neighbors support each other and work together to solve problems. Elena's willingness to share her research, Tom Fletcher's testimony about Brenda's requests for false complaints, David Patel's technical expertise. These weren't legal obligations or HOA requirements. They were acts of solidarity from people who understood that protecting one family's rights was protecting everyone's rights. The charging station still hums quietly every night, converting electrical energy into the power that moves our car, but it represents something larger. Now, the principle that innovation and progress shouldn't be sacrificed to appease those who profit from conflict and control. Our children are growing up in a neighborhood where the HOA exists to serve the community, not the other way around. They're learning that rules should be fair, that authority should be accountable, and that standing up for what's right is worth the cost. That may be the most important legacy of our power struggle, not the legal precedents or the policy reforms, but the example that ordinary people can fight back against abuse and win if they're willing to stand together and refuse to give up. The power struggle is over. Justice prevailed, and sometimes that's enough to change the world.